Firstly, let me give you a brief introduction of the Environmental Foundation Limited. So the Environmental Foundation Limited, I'm sure you all would have heard about this institution, is a public interest litigation organization in Sri Lanka, which has been in operation for the last 41 years with the objective of conserving Sri Lanka's natural resources through legal and scientific means. EFL's work ranges from litigation to conservation and scientific research, including collaborative efforts with government officials to develop national policies and legal reforms, implement projects, and create awareness amongst the public. Carrying the tagline, Justice for Nature, EFL has been in the forefront in environmental litigation and has been recognized for being an impartial and apolitical organization since its inception. Some of the important work carried out by EFL are influencing the formulation of national wetlands conservation policy, the government, and also influencing the government to halt the construction of the Sampur coal power plant, influencing the establishment of a vehicle emission testing system through a Supreme Court decision or judgment to address the high level of air pollution in Colombo and island-wide, and contributing to the formulation of the 6th National Report on Biodiversity for the Convention on Biological Diversity, to name a few. Also, an introduction to the Counter Wildlife Trafficking Awareness and Capacity and Empowerment Program. Sri Lanka Counter Wildlife Trafficking Awareness, Capacity and Empowerment Program, also known as ACE, is a project funded by the US Department of State, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, implemented by the Environmental Foundation Limited in collaboration with the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the Freeland Foundation, and the Blue Resources Trust. It seeks to facilitate formal and informal interactions between law enforcement authorities, prosecution, the judiciary, and civil society in the detention of wildlife trafficking, to seizure of assets and prosecution of wildlife traffickers. The combined efforts will aim to result in a long-term counter-wildlife trafficking program activated by the Sri Lankan government to combat wildlife trafficking within and beyond Sri Lankan borders. Firstly, let me start with the introduction of our distinguished panelists. The first speaker, Dr. Kalinga Padmalal, is a wildlife ecologist and biodiversity expert. He is a skilled wildlife biologist, protected area planner, nature-based ecotourism educator, environment educator, and environmental policy planner, an administrator and team leader, and a coordinator with more than 20 years of experience. Currently, he is working as a senior lecturer at the Department of Zoology at the Open University of Sri Lanka. He is a member of the Fauna and Flora Advisory Board to the Minister of the Department of Wildlife. He is also a member of the Department of Wildlife Conservation Research Committee for nearly 20 years. Moreover, he is also a member of the Presidential Task Force to formulate the wildlife policy. So, without further ado, I request Dr. Kalinga Padmalal to start with his presentation on the conservation of biodiversity in Sri Lanka. Dr. Kalinga.
Okay, thank you very much for giving an opportunity to address the audience like you, who can play a very vital role in the conservation of Sri Lanka at present and in the future. So my I will check that the video is on. Video is on.
Dr. Kalinga, we can't see you at the moment.
That's what I'm asking. Okay. All right. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
So once again, I must thank the EFL Foundation for giving me this opportunity. So my topic is basically the new approach for conservation of biodiversity through the protected area and outside the protected area network in the country. So, which is very important in the present day context. So before moving to these protected areas and biodiversity and all, So I will will go through, and as you are coming from different walk of discipline and are coming from the different walk of different type of education background, I would like to just run through some of the fundamental terminologies that we were always dealing with. So if you see this planetary system that where we are located, you can see somewhere here is the Earth. So you can see the size and where we are surviving. And within that context, we are talking about the biodiversity, but very important to know that there are two terms that always we are using as a conservationist or developers or sustainable development, whatever. One is the environment, the other one is the biodiversity. That is the two terms that we use. But when you're talking of the environment and biodiversity, there is another important thing that we will have to discuss and to understand, that is called the sustainable development. And therefore, environment and biodiversity, it is very important in achieving the sustainable development goal. Now, that is what we are talking today. And sustainable utilization at the end. And also, we should know about this terminology, and we are in the era of achieving sustainable development goals, because we have the United Nations have development program have put forward 17 goals. It will be discussed by some others. So when you're talking of the environment, the one term, and the other biodiversity, what is called environment? Basically, it is a surrounding, all the physical surrounding on Earth are called environment. The environment, as you say, surroundings, everything with the living, everything non-living. That includes the people, animal, plants, and all other living things. Rely on the non-living parts of the environment to survive. So therefore, basically, non-living and living and physical, everything surrounding us, we call the environment. So natural environment, then we have a natural environment or natural world. That's another term coming up with us. So environment, the natural environment is the thing that encompassing all the living and non-living things occurring naturally. Meaning, in this case, not artificial. Therefore, we have a special term here, non-artificial natural environment. So I will be explaining why I'm trying to say that the natural environment. So the term is most often applied to the earth or some part of the earth as environment. So natural environment, as we are talking, that we are living. So I basically as this photograph or the figure on my right has shown that it encompasses all the living and non-living things that occur naturally on Earth. Or very often, it is replaced by the word, sometimes we call habitat, which means the most of the time, if you talk about your environment, it's the same. But when you are defining it, you will have to define it in a different way. The natural environment has several components, and the earth environment, basically what we are talking, includes the lithosphere, where the soil and other part that you are talking, we call the lithosphere. Then the water cycle and the water component of the earth, we call the hydrosphere. Then the above lithosphere, you have the atmosphere. Those are the three major components that we are talking. So apart from that, we have ice caps. That area we call the chrysosphere. Within this system, we are powered by the solar energy. Within that atmosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, there are some limits that living organism can survive. That particular area, n-dimensional area of the environment that provide the opportunity for living thing to survive, we call the biosphere. So these are where we are really concerned about it. The lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and the biosphere. So these are the areas where the environment, the planet Earth is going to provide us by interacting each other, different, services. As far as I mentioned about the natural environment, lithosphere, biosphere, of course, the hydrosphere, we are having within the system because human has and other people have evolved. So what is called human-made environment, we call it is called built environment. As you see in this area, one of these, the ancient irrigation system, what we call cascading system here, within this human-made environment, that is the area which has been twisted by human for their own requirements. So as we evolve with other animals and our lifestyle change from hunting and gathering, then we went to the cultivation and harvesting as we do today. So you change the environment, we call built environment. So within this built environment, natural environment, then the built environment, we are talking. Then there is another environment called social cultural environment. Social cultural environment, it is the immediate physical and social setting in which human beings live and also where things happen or develop. It explores further into the culture of societies and how they influence individuals. So the social and cultural environment will influence the individual. Ultimately, the aspect of social environment therefore include culture, language, social condition, social classes that we are talking, the health of the environment, type of occupation that you are talking, and the economic condition of the people living with specific parameters. So we have the natural, we have the built, and we have social environment. This environment we are moving towards in achieving the environment, achieving the sustainable goal. So apart from this individual, family, community, religious, educational and economic and political institutions also mark our social environment, make our social environment. It is usually from the family that most key activities of society are carried out. And also one learns that how to live as a member of the society. So we have different society right from the beginning. So therefore culture is also shaped by the natural environment and the interaction between the individuals in the community. So if you can see that on the right hand side, we see that our cultural environment, how we evolved, how we developed. You can see from the bunker tour in there, those are the prehistoric environment that we had been living at that time. So those are the different environment conditions, different environment parameters that we need to talk about before we get into the biodiversity. That is another vital component of the present day context. So biodiversity means we know that it is simply a variety of life on Earth. So as I mentioned earlier, the biosphere, where the living things are continuing to survive, this sphere is called the biosphere. The variety of life on that particular path of the Earth we call biodiversity. So if you want to elaborate further into different levels, I think the convention on biodiversity. So actually, I use the convention of biodiversity, but for your understanding, I would like to say that there is no convention on biodiversity. That is the convention on biological diversity that we are talking. So whether we are talking of biodiversity, the convention is addressing the biological diversity. So what biological diversity and biodiversity in simple words that people are talking, we will be discussing. Biological diversity is the refer to the whole variety of and variability of the life on Earth. The life found on Earth, that means the plant, animal, fungi, microorganisms, as well as to the communities that they form and the habitats in which they live, we call biodiversity. It also refers to the variety of life on Earth at all levels. Start from the gene to the ecosystem. Gene, you have the species, and ecosystem, we will be discussing of the three component of the biological diversity. So the biological diversity, variety of life, if I put everything into the one basket, then I'll be able to distinguish, categorize from the biological diversity basket, three major categories further. If I'm going to do that, then we will be having the what is called genetic diversity. So genetic diversity is coming from the same species. Now, if you are very familiar, for an example, if you go to a cemetery, more or less my majority of you have gone. So when you see the minimal or the Catharines of yeah, you can see a lot of color, various colors. So each species, although they are coming under the same species, they produce different type of chemicals and the qualities. So therefore, within the species, you have different genetic forms. So this genetic structure, genetics is called genetic diversity. So if you come across the same species, you have a lot of opportunities for different type of gene engineering, genetic engineering work. So this is a very good example, but when you go to if you see the Ratmal, right? You are very familiar. We have Raturatmal, Kaharatmal, different types. But each and every plant, every flower can provide different type of qualitative chemicals. So even in the Madurutala that you find in here, in Colombo or even Mondragal or Girandrugote, the ability to repel the mosquito will be different. So therefore, the quality of a species will be governed by the genetic material in simple terms, and that is called the genetic diversity. So species diversity, you know that you have different type of species found in this earth, even in your home, even in your garden. So therefore, these species are a major component of the biological diversity that we are talking. So therefore, from the variety of life on earth, I can see that the species are there. So apart from that, you have some species that are found in Sri Lanka. And these are some bird species. These are some found in different part of the country. Some of them are endemic. Some of them are indigenous. Some of them are migratory. Some of them are like that. You have different species. So when you talk about the variety of life, there's a message. Hello everyone, if you have any, okay, sorry. So if you have this biological diversity component with you came with the genetic diversity, you came with the species diversity, but when we further analyze this biological diversity, these species and genetic materials found in different communities and different habitats, those things are differently called ecosystems. For instance, these ecosystems are found in different part of the country, found in different part of the world because of their edaphic, climatic, and soil and other features, and the fauna and flora interact with each other. Therefore, as you see, for an example, you will not get mangroves in hot plains or hill country areas. Mangroves will be encountered only in the places where river meets the sea. With the salinitic gradient, you have specific type of vegetation. Similarly, mountain regions, the hill country areas of many nations are having the mountain vegetation types. When it comes to the dry zone areas, when it comes to wet zone areas, so you have wide array of ecosystem, and that is we call ecosystem diversity. So biological diversity refers to the variety of life and interacting system on an area, which can be further divided into three major categories: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. So as far as the Sri Lanka is concerned, we are very much about the Sri Lankan concern. You can see the right hand side, the map of Sri Lanka, which radiates from, I know, the lot of rivers coming from the central hills. If you cut the Sri Lanka across from the north to east, you will be able to see that the three peneplains, just like three steps. So the majority of the rivers are originating from these peneplains and meanders through the different peneplains and reach the country, the sea. So going through this will create a lot of habitat and associated ecosystems. So we can see that the central hills, the top photograph here, is the misty central hill where the fog interception can be taken place and absorb and radiate, absorb and put it into the ground and radiate through the vein system, just like the river system and stream. And you can see how the second peneplains and the associated fauna and flora. So the biological diversity is important in this respect for their location and how they interact with the other activities. So if you go to see the Sri Lanka, you can see the different mountains in the central highlands coming from different aspects. So the edaphic factor, topography, climate, the temperature, weather, combination of these factors will give rise to different ecosystems and also associated fauna and flora and their genetic diversity. So these are the major rivers that are originating from Sri Lanka, and you will be able to see that how the river systems and their respective major river basin originating from Sri Lankan peneplains. So therefore, these things are very important for you all, for us, for our conservation purpose. On the left hand side, you can see the protected area network and forest cover in the country. You can see that based on the climatic conditions, this is how the protected area network in Sri Lanka. The pink color is coming under the wildlife department and the green color is mainly with the forest department. Those are the two major agencies responsible for conservation of biodiversity as protected area network we will be discussing in the future soon. Therefore, if you consider this protected area network on the right hand side, you will be able to see red patches more toward the central hills and the western part of the country. These are the places where high distribution of endemic species of the country. The recent maps shows that the distribution endemic species are confined to the hill country, wet zone, mountains, also southwestern wet zone of the country. So when you consider to compare the two maps, there is an issue. So the majority of the protected areas located in the wet zone or the dry zone areas where endemicity is much more higher in mountain zones and the wet zone area. So there is a big gap in establishing protected areas throughout the country for the conservation of genetic, species and ecosystem diversity. So we'll see what's really happened. So in the forest cover, if you see from earlier up to now, you can see that in 2050 only 30%. So during the last 1800, it is 80% of the forest cover. So forest cover associated with their habitats, and when the habitat destruction is taking place like that, and there is a tremendous impact on the biodiversity of the fauna and flora of those areas. So the elephants are one of the major animals who are having the largest roam range is affected due to this forest cover diminishing in those areas. So you can see that some of the rivers originating from these areas are very vital for the country. So these are different climatic areas of the second peninsular covering knuckles and low country wet zone areas, and there are certain patanas. These are also different type of ecosystem that we are talking under the biological diversity. So there is a very good landscape and associated with the cultural diversity is there. If you go to knuckle areas, there are some people who are living with the nature. We are called them ecosphere people. So then you can see that the rainfall is governed by two monsoon rains coming from the southwest and the northeast, mainly due to the atmospheric depression in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabic Sea, and we will get the different Yalamaha season for different parts of the country. So these are not only this biological diversity associated with that natural areas, but also there are certain areas, as I mentioned, we have evolved from the hunting and gathering to the agriculture and the cultivation and harvesting. We have different types of agriculture biodiversity throughout the country. So that is also respected and must be conserved. You can see that different land use planning are there from the indigenous people to conserve the biodiversity and to use the biodiversity and their agriculture production in a very good way. So these are some of the problems that we are facing today with the introduction of tree to the central highlands in the country, where majority of the endemic species were present and they were wiped out. So therefore, conservation measures need to be taken within this context, right? So therefore, what is this conservation? Everybody is talking. According to the World Conservation Strategy, the word what we say, conservation is basically based on the management of our use, human use of the biosphere. If you can remember, I specifically mentioned the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, where within that region, n-dimensional structure where the living organisms are present, we call biosphere. Therefore, human use of the biosphere that we will have to manage in a way that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefit. You must have to have a Chirasara benefit, in other terms, to the present generation. You will look after the present generation by managing this while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspiration of the future generation. So you can't enjoy everything today and you can't leave nothing to the future generation. So you have to use it in a sustainable development way, sustainable utilization of resources. Though we are talking about the World Conservation Strategy, conservation and sustainable utilization, our forefathers, as you are very well aware, we are now coming, if the Suddha fellow is telling something about the sustainable utilization, talking about the we are very happy to grab them. But if you consider the very basic poem that during my period we studied, that is called Mega Sebo Panidodantibe. That poem itself gives how our forefathers, our parents utilize the resources in a very meaningful way. Apart from that, people are coming out, we are talking today, these are things happening, lack of coordinations. So this is there in our blood. Lack of coordination is there because, I just want to remind you that during good old days, our days, we were very, very concerned about another poem we'll call Dunna Dunugami, Talagitulagami, Ralamigami, Muekendway Sabarakami. There is a lack of coordination. Were inculcated our mind during those maybe 50 to 60 years ago. But if the Suddha fellow says something lack of coordination, we are very willing to grab, but we already neglect our old culture. So if you are talking of this sustainable utilization of management of human use of biosphere with three major objectives. One is to maintain the ecological process and the life supporting system. So if you are doing the conservation of this biological diversity, you will have to maintain the ecological process and life supporting system for present and future generations. Therefore, you must allow the primary product. You must allow the primary production to happen. Then the clean air, the nutrient cycling, human size survival and development. So then second objective, as I mentioned, you have to have the genetic diversity, which I mentioned. These are having a lot of endemic biota in the different part of the country. Those materials are very important for agriculture and domestic farm animals and drugs. And also these are very important, that is where we need. So then you have the species and ecosystem, which support the support the people. You need to talk on this one. So summary in this definition, what we can say, you need to protect, you need to use, you need to regulate, and you need to manage. So summary of the conservation is protect, use, regulate, and management are these four are called the 4 pillars of conservation. If you work in that way, the conservation is paramount of importance. Why we are here today? Why we are here today? These are some photographs coming from the Sahara Desert beginning. Everybody was evolved from the Sahara as along with other animals. So now we evolved with other animal, and now we have evolved up to Homo sapiens sapiens, and now we are talking here, we need 80% of the land and rest of the animal will be given only 20% of that. If those animals knew at that time that naked Anthropopithecus is there to create this problem, they would have finished that animal at that time. So this is how we came. Desert life, hunting and gathering, then the house construction, then society is developed, then this is where these are lower things showed you how the human race developed from the South Africa and migrated or dispersed throughout the world and came here. Now with the above picture, you can say that you evolved from the water. Nowadays you can see you evolved and you are putting the garbage into the water where that is to your womb. So we are the people who are very, very, the disastrous to the nature. This is to show you that how we came today. Ramapithecus, Australopithecus, and different time intervals. The time is passing very well, and this is this Neanderthal which went to the South African, and this is a photograph of our ancestors taken from the last century, and we are also living in different part of the country, conserving the wildlife in that way. So we are here. We have a lot of problems, and this picture will show you to come up with different policies and strategies and the law for conservation of the environment. Because if you see the pictures, if you compare the pictures, you will see that you are having a huge problem. Therefore, based on this one, you need to come up with different policies and laws in order to conserve the conservation of this one. So therefore, I am running out of time because so Article 2 of the consent, there is a convention on biodiversity. I am very sorry. In 1972, there was a UN conference on environment. Then they say that the solution for the poverty is to undertake the development. That is in the development in 1972. But today we say that the poverty is mainly due to the degradation of wildlife today. So therefore, there are so many things, our common future, and therefore sustainable development, which was forwarded by the Brundtland report, development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. I will rush to this one slide, because not only this, when you are talking about the conservation, we have 2,500 years of conservation policy, which was inculcated and brought to us by the Arahat Mahinda. So you know that the great king, the birds of the air, something like that, and is a part of our slogan now. Samantha Pasadika, it highly highlighted these sayings of this one. After that, there are so many people established, and this is the one, they want to be established, Mahameuna, Uyana, Mihinsare Sanctuary at that time for conservation. Then the Nissankamal, others make some conservation areas coming from this one. because he declared within 7 to 8 cows from the Anuradhapura sacred city, you can't fish animal in the tank. So in a way, those are the conservation policies and the protected areas established at that time. So apart from that, we are the first people who developed the human sanctuaries. So Mihintale sanctuary was there, then the kids is monk there. So fundamental mechanism of loss of biodiversity for our journey, habitat destruction or exploitation, pollution, global climate change into species and area-centered increase in population, industrial and other things. So you will be able to see some of these activities and introduce species, garbage, and it is a therapy. So therefore, I would like to come to one slide, please, and I will go half an hour. It is not that much easy for me to finish, because I would say we have two options. We have two options to conserve the biodiversity on this planet. So this is, you be very carefully understand this particular one. We have two options under this sun to conserve the biodiversity on this planet or biological diversity. One is the Alive program, one is the Dead program. Alive program is the conserving biodiversity as alive program. Dead programs, those are found in museum, herbarium and other places. Under the Alive program, you have in situ conservation and ex situ conservation programs. In situ conservation program, you say that you conserve the gene and species and ecosystem on the site. On the other hand, we have the ex situ conservation program. Sometimes when the animals are becoming endangered and there are climatic change and droughts are taking place, we will take some of the species away from the original place and bring it to some safe place and trying to conserve. So therefore, in situ conservation, ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation, again, we are having two options. One is the whole animals or the whole part of the animal. Of the part of the species, you have genes, tissues, those bags. If you have the whole animals, botanical garden, zoological and so forth. If it is in situ conservation, you have the protected area network, you have the protected area concept, and you have the outside the protected area net concept. So therefore, habitat management and the species management, you have two categories. Apart from that protected area network, we are having the community participation, other environmental conservation measures, which is going to come as a new policy, and it was approved by the cabinet. So therefore, you have in situ, other environmental conservation measures, ex situ, those are the strategies that we can conserve them. So therefore, a lot of opportunities are there. Unfortunately, so the protected area concept, basically, areas, geographical area is protected, access and uses activities are regulated by law, then you can have different type of protected areas within that region. So therefore, I am running out of time, sorry, but if you have any questions, you can, half an hour is not enough, sorry, but I will conclude my very short presentation at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padmalal, for that very detailed presentation on the conservation of biodiversity and all those very moving images that you made as part of your presentation. I know it's a difficult ask to contain all of that information into a half-an-hour presentation, but we thank you very much. And I encourage our participants to post your questions, and you can specifically address them to Dr. Padmalal at the end of the session. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite our next distinguished panelist, Mrs. Manori Gunawardena. A brief introduction. Mrs. Gunawardena is a wildlife scientist and started her research career at the Center for Conservation Research, studying elephants ranging patterns in southern Sri Lanka. Currently, she's a director at the Environmental Foundation Limited. She is also the country representative for the Born Free Foundation of the United Kingdom. She is also an Eisenhower Fellow Women in Leadership from 2010. In addition to that, she is a member of the IUCN Special Survival Commission Asian Elephant Specialist Group, and she is a member of the IUCN Special Survival Commission Crocodile Specialist Group and the Sri Lanka delegation to the CITES Conference of Parties in 2016 and 2019. Without further ado, may I invite Mrs. Gunawardena for her presentation on wildlife trafficking and impact on the ecology and biodiversity and conservation. Mrs. Gunawardena.
Can you see?
Yes, Mrs. Gunawardena. We can.
Okay. They have to stop this screen share over there, so I can share mine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope my audio is clear. I'd like to thank the Bar Association for partnering Environment Foundation in bringing to light a very key topic in Sri Lanka, which is actually looking at the issues surrounding wildlife trafficking and trade. And I'd also like to touch on and follow up on Professor Padmalal's talk about our natural wealth and our natural assets, how Sri Lanka is a very biodiverse country. We have protected areas. We have fauna and flora that are unique to Sri Lanka. And then we are looking at what are exploitative practices. And the other thing that I would like to remind all of you is to just think back that the COVID pandemic and all the chaos that ensued is a byproduct of our relationship with the environment and with a direct link to what is wildlife trade. So there's illegal trade and legal trade. It's legal trade and illegal trade, and direct linkages to bushmeat markets that brought about the transference of disease that had the impact that resulted in the COVID pandemic. So zoonotic diseases have a direct linkage to our relationship with wildlife. So, for example, this, if you look at this, this is your typical Department of Wildlife Conservation apprehension of illegal bushmeat. So whenever we talk about trafficking or trade, we think of Ladamas or bushmeat trade. The picture in the middle is actually a piece of a pangolin. We have a picture of pangolins being snared and removed. The reason I put pangolins up there is because there was some anecdotal evidence that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, was linked to pangolin trade. So these are pictures taken in Sri Lanka by Department of Wildlife staff and people making those arrests. So we must understand that there is a local market for wildlife products, and I'm pretty sure that if any of you have traveled to sort of the wilderness areas of Sri Lanka, it's quite commonplace, and you may be offered bushmeat. While you may not take part in killing the animal, you are definitely contributing to it. I'm sorry you can't see the presentation, I'm told. I'm trying to just fix that. Just give me 2 seconds and I will recap the images. And we'll just put the play on. Sorry about that. Technical glitches sorted out. Okay, so here's the image. Take a good look. Like I mentioned, this is bushmeat, venison. There's some pangolin in the middle, and there's pangolin here. The reason I have the pangolin up is because pangolins were also linked to the COVID pandemic and was initially suspected as one of the source animals in terms of COVID. And also just take note that these are all happening in Sri Lanka. So we do have people interacting with dead fauna and you know, the likelihood of disease transfer. So anyone visiting national parks or going close to national parks or pilgrimage sites, you're offered bushmeat. This is the state it arrives in, and this is how you get it. So this is something that you shouldn't indulge in. And if you do know of people indulging in it, please dissuade them from that. So this is our local market in wildlife products. If you say in a very simple sense, this is what people think is wildlife trafficking and trade. You know, poaching, bushmeat, consumption. However, if you look at it sort of from a broader perspective, there's a lot more happening. So we have these tusks on the right, which are actually African elephant tusks that were stopped in the Colombo port by customs. They're originating from multiple countries. It was a huge stockpile that was detected, and then it was subsequently destroyed. And then on your left, you would see what are the canine teeth of leopard, and then the sort of the little vial you see is leopard fat. So we do have a domestic trade in even our charismatic species. I know, very shocking, and I just put these pictures out there because the other thing that everybody looks at when you talk about wildlife trafficking and trade, you always know the impact of sort of ivory poaching on elephants, African elephants. I'm sure you've all seen the horrific images. The population declines in those countries. Same for carnivores. But having said that, it does happen in Sri Lanka as well. So this is something that I would like to flag. As usual, we always sort of look at the charismatic species in terms of trade, the tiger trade, the ivory trade. These are the things that we hear of, even in international fora. But wildlife trafficking and trade is far, far more pervasive and is actually quite broad. So smuggling. So if you look at this image, this is the image again of a stop done in Sri Lanka. And if you look at it, it's a lot of scorpions. So multiple scorpions, and this is a huge collection. So this is a smuggler that's apprehended, and there's a lot of smuggling that's happening out of Sri Lanka. A lot of it is unknown and unquantified. Some of these species haven't been identified. There are so many. We still haven't figured out why these animals were being smuggled at that time, but this is happening. So this happens through air routes, sea routes, and multiple areas. So just to focus on why we are, yes, concerned about our charismatic megafauna and wildlife trafficking, what is being pillaged and plundered is really our natural assets and natural wealth. There are the thousands of species that are unique to Sri Lanka. So if you look at the types of wildlife, it's similar to other types of crime, right? So we must always think that these are not sort of incidental or unplanned or sort of some one-off incident. It's organized, it's networked, it's profit motivated, certainly profit motivated, it's very profitable. And then you have it at sort of national or transnational level, feeding what is an increasing demand. So if you look at crime in general, after trafficking drugs, people and arms, wildlife trafficking is the fourth largest lucrative crime. And you know, like like all other organized crime, you have this networked aspect to it, far more organized than we would think. Certainly in Sri Lanka, we don't seem to recognize the network and organized aspect of it. We still look at it as one of incidents. So, everybody's familiar with this map. These are just the cargo routes for Sri Lanka. And the reason Sri Lanka is special is again because of our geographic location. As you know, for decades we've been sort of a hub. We are a maritime hub. We are sort of at a crossroads here. And therefore, by default, also a hub for trafficking. Right? So let's talk about some of these well-known but sort of lesser species that are in trade. Star tortoises. The reason I put star tortoises up there is that one is that they're the most trafficked tortoise species in the world. Second is that I'm pretty sure every one of you or knows someone who has had a pet star tortoise in some point of time. So they're very pretty, very tempting for people. I know a lot of Sri Lankans, when they go on holiday to the dry zone, they find a star tortoise, they pick it up for their kids as a pet. So in the pet trade. And globally, they are extremely sought out. So this is what happens. Is that they are smuggled and they are part of this India and Sri Lanka nexus of trafficking in star tortoises. And this is how they're transported. Like tortoises, and these pictures are taken from a fishing trawler. There have been multiple stops of these originating maybe from Sri Lanka, maybe from India. They haven't ascertained whether it's a combination of both or just singular. So by sea, these are confiscated animals that are housed at a facility run by the zoo. So most of it are from fishing trawlers with some Indian connection. And then the northwestern coast in Sri Lanka seems to be a hotspot for this. So what would happen if we have these thousands of star tortoises removed from the wild? And literally that is an unknown, and it is happening sort of unseen in Sri Lanka and in India. So for example, in India, the star tortoise is actually missing from most of its original habitat. It's lost a lot of ground. Now, you might think, okay, relatively common in Sri Lanka, yes, relatively common, but maybe not so in the near future. Because this is how they're smuggled in many ways. Once in fishing trawlers, and this is in your luggage. So wrapped up, taped up. And the reason people do this, a star tortoise is worth about $2,000 in the international pet markets. So it is very lucrative, right? So while they are being removed from the wild and most likely from easy locations like national parks or just outside parks, you add habitat loss, and then you look at things like agriculture, machinery, pesticide use, farmland, the change in the nature of agriculture, that impacts the species overall. So on top of the habitat pressures that a species faces, you have trafficking and trade, and then that impacts a species negatively. So the other thing I'd like to talk about are endemic lizards. So if you go back to Dr. Padmalal's talk, he talks about our biodiversity areas and our southwest zone, which is kind of hub of endemism. And if you look at this, this is a screen grab from Instagram. You have somebody putting a picture of a Lyriocephalus, which is the hump-nosed lizard, which is endemic to Sri Lanka, which means only found in Sri Lanka in certain locations, not all over the country, in the west of Sri Lanka. And just, it is what they call a dream catch or a dream finding. So it's a dream lizard for some people in the pet trade. So I'm not quite sure what's so endearing about having a pet lizard, whether, it's out of interest. Why is there such a market? So Sri Lankan endemic agamids are being traded on online platforms in foreign countries. And that impacts these species. So these are all endangered species as well. They have different listings. For example, there were German pet traders caught in 2010. There were some others in 2012. There was a collector in 2016. There have been others since. There was a study done by the organization Trafficking. And that was also highlighting the different trades in Sri Lankan reptiles and reptiles native to Sri Lanka. And the most dangerous thing about this is that they're sourcing from places where there are other conservation threats. So as you know, our rainforests and wet zone forests are severely fragmented. And there is a lot of habitat, not just loss and deforestation. Everybody talks about deforestation, but it's actually degradation of forests as well with increasing human activity. And as forests degrade, not necessarily deforest, these special niche species like lizards that need very special environment conditions to survive within that forest, they lose out. And as these forests reduce and as we make more inroads into them, what happens is that you have an increased offtake of these so-called sought-after species. So this is a snapshot of species that are in Sri Lanka that were found in international online trade. And these are just the number of offers that were given. There are many websites that actually advertise Sri Lankan endemics for sale. We have, it's on social media platforms. So the trade is very pervasive purely because it's extremely lucrative. So let's talk about why. Why would somebody want a lizard from Sri Lanka? I mean, what's so interesting about a lizard? Other than, some of them are quite pretty. One is that they're unique. So they're found nowhere else. So it's a trophy. It's a status symbol. I have this lizard that's only found in one forest, where like cotton plains, maybe Singaraja, where you don't have any more. Second, there's a huge market that is thriving on the pet trade. So the exotic pet trade is a big business. So there is products. So for example, this is a terrarium. A terrarium is sort of like an aquarium where you keep reptiles. That is Sri Lanka theme that you can buy online. And then you would want a Sri Lankan lizard to live in that. So that is why. There is a market for it. There is the demand for it, and it's purely based on sort of a status. I have this unique lizard. So how do they get them? A lot of times they're fraudulently sourced. In Sri Lanka, they are fraudulently sourced. I mean, that we know. And then they're laundered as captive bred. So that's another mechanism of getting out. If you do get on any of the social media platforms, you just type in the taxonomic name, that is the scientific name for any of these species, and they will pop up in all kinds of people's hands and little shops. Okay, so then what else? Something that I'd like to touch on, which is extremely important, again, looking at our geographic location, is the smuggling in marine species. Now we don't think of marine species. We are all aware of, the illegal trade in terrestrial wildlife. So whether it's a megafauna, whether it's the pet trade with things like star tortoises, it could be endemic birds. We don't think of marine products as illegal because we think of it as, say, fish. So we don't look at it as a great problem. Public perception does not think trafficking relates to marine species, but it does. It's well documented. There's some really good studies recently that have come out that documents the trade in sea cucumbers escalating in Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka becoming a hub. That is with India in the past several years banning the trade in sea cucumbers. Sri Lanka has not banned the trade in sea cucumber yet. India has banned it, so there is a lot of cross-border trade and trafficking happening, and Sri Lanka being a hotspot. There's also a lot of reports of certain types of sharks that you cannot trade, and it is illegal being found in international air cargo. And again, we exported, and if you look at this picture of a tea box, that's seahorses. Again, seahorses are trafficked and traded in Sri Lanka. So these are some marine species. There are multiple species. It gets far more complicated than looking at terrestrial species. You know, if you look at lizards, there are only so many species that are easily identified. It's very hard to identify shark fin, the different species of seahorses, sea cucumbers. It's something very hard to monitor and enforce, unlike maybe some other terrestrial fauna trade. Then I'd also like to touch on the trade in flora. So yes, I know we all talk about animals and you know, charismatic or not so charismatic, from scorpions to elephants, sea cucumber, shark fin. If you look at the volume of trade Sri Lanka generates, that's illegal. The highest volume is in what you call agarwood. Agarwood is Vallapatta. The core of the tree is actually forms a resin, and the resin is distilled into what is an aromatic perfume that's extremely sought after in the Middle East. And Vallapatta, that is found in the red zone of Sri Lanka, is actually going into decline, where people are illegally logging and removing it and trading. So you will see these pictures of small wood chips. And this is something that is a regular occurrence, where we have stops at Sri Lanka Customs, for example, at the airport, with trading Vallapatta. It has a disastrous impact on our wildlife and our wilderness areas as people make inroads to them. Second, what we have is I just want you to look at this Sri Lanka the smuggling of rosewood, which is originating from Madagascar, where entire forests were removed, and then it transited through Sri Lanka, and now there's a hold by customs. So I've touched on the trade in flora. It's as pervasive as the trade in fauna. It's not as well documented or recognized by enforcement and the public. So this is something to be extremely mindful of. So I'd like to thank all of you. I've only just briefly touched on the main themes of trafficking and trade in Sri Lanka and the impact on conservation. And I'd like to end it by saying that, you know, we have to be really mindful about how we deal with our natural resources and our natural wealth. And this is our natural wealth that is being trafficked and squandered. So it's not just about the charismatic megafauna, it's about the thousands of other species that Sri Lanka hosts. And I think the following presenters would talk about all the mechanisms available to conserve and counter trafficking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gunawardena, for that very detailed presentation. I myself have some questions which I hope to pose to you at the end of the session. Now, I invite Dr. Jagath Gunawardena, who is many of us have had the pleasure of meeting and also being part of his lectures at the University of Colombo. And he would now be taking over and presenting an overview of laws dealing with wildlife and the illegal wildlife trafficking trade. Dr. Gunawardena, may I also briefly introduce Dr. Gunawardena, who definitely doesn't need an introduction, but he's one of the most senior environmental lawyers in Sri Lanka, who's specialized in environmental law and intellectual property law. He received his PhD in biology from the University of Sri Lanka, and he is also an attorney at law who has been at the forefront of environmental litigation for the past 32 years. Dr. Gunawardena also holds a diploma in agriculture with first-class honors and received a gold medal for his results. Furthermore, he has been head of the legal department at the Environmental Foundation Limited. Currently, he is the president of the National Environmental Council of the Central Environmental Authority. In his career, he has also been distinguished by being awarded the Presidential Award of Excellence and Environmental Conservation as far back as 2005, and has been awarded the Haritha Abhimani Lifetime Award for Environmental Conservation in 2016, and the Presidential Award of Excellence for Service for Wildlife Conservation. Dr. Gunawardena.
Thank you for that introduction. I will deal with the domestic elements of the illegal wildlife trade, and I will deal with the legal provisions that can be made use of to deal with the illegal wildlife trade in Sri Lanka. The country, or which comes into the country, or which is exported from this country in violation of one or more provisions of any existing legislation. So illegal means it may be a trade, whether internal or external, which is transgressing the provisions of any of the established laws. Basically, the three laws that deal with wildlife trade, whether it is legal or illegal, is the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, the Forest Conservation Ordinance, and the provisions of the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. So a trade in wildlife becomes illegal if it is violating the provisions of either of these three or more than one of these ordinances and enactments. So it may be in violation of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, it may be in violation of the provisions of the Forest Conservation Ordinance, or it may be in violation of the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. Coming behind the presentation of Ms. Manori Gunawardena, I think I can cite some of these examples, show which provisions have been violated. Coming to the domestic trade, we have been talking about the illegal trade in elephants, which is of course a clear case of violation of the provisions of Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. And the sections that deal with the protection of elephants are from provisions in sections 12 to 24. And according to the provisions of section 12, it is illegal to capture any elephant without having a permit to do so. And we all know that permits have to be issued under section 13 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and no permit has been issued for more than 30 years to private parties. Therefore, any capture of wild elephants, whether it be a cub elephant or a grown-up elephants, except by the Department of Wildlife Conservation, is illegal. And anyone who keeps such an elephant is in violation of the provisions of section 22A of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, in addition to the violation of provisions in section 12. And therefore, any person who keeps any tusk or part of tusk, such as elephant pearl or gajamutu, will be in violation of section 24 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. And in between, there are other provisions like section 17, which says that all parts of a dead elephant are the property of the state. Therefore, there cannot be any owners of any parts of the elephants. They can be only the custodians who may be allowed to keep the elephants or their parts. So there are no elephant owners in Sri Lanka according to the provisions of the legal system. We can only have become custodians of elephants or their parts. When it comes to other mammals, they are protected under Section 30. That is, all mammals indigenous to Sri Lanka other than elephants are coming under Section 30. And under Section 30, there is two categories. One is Section 30, subsection 1, that declares which are protected animals, and Section 30, subsection 2, that declares what are the strictly protected mammals. And strictly protected mammals have 20 species in the list, and they are listed under Schedule 2 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance under Section 30, subsection 2. When you look at this provision and the schedule, you can see that there are 20 species of strictly protected mammals, which includes 12 marine mammals, and out of the marine mammals, there are heavily traded species like the dugong, which is of course domestically traded, and the flesh of certain other marine mammals, which are also domestically traded. But when it comes to strictly protected mammals, there is the pangolin, or the Indian pangolin to be very precise, which is of course having both the national and international dimension, because the flesh is traded naturally, whereas the scutes or the scales like things that cover its body are traded in the international arena. So there may be certain instances like the Indian pangolin, which involves both domestic and international trade. Coming to Section 30, reptiles are also protected under this provision, and Section 30, subsection 1 has protected reptiles, and Sri Lanka protects all reptiles except for 5 species of snakes that can incur a fatal bite. That is the cobra, the saw-scale viper, the spotted viper, and the 2 species of kraits, namely the Indian krait and the Sri Lankan or Ceylon krait. Except for these 5 species of snakes, all reptiles are protected. So all geckos, skinks, lizards, everything is protected, and so are the 3 species of tortoises and the 5 species of turtles that come here to breed. Now, coming to the protected reptiles, I'm emphasizing this because you may remember Ms. Manori presenting so many cases of reptiles that have been traded, and some of these species are protected and the others are strictly protected. And it is sad to note that all these reptiles that have been traded from Sri Lanka are protected species. So we are losing protected species due to international illegal wildlife trade. When it comes to strictly protected reptiles, we have 16 species in the list, but when you look at it from the practical point of view, the de facto list is 18 species. Let me just emphasize how that happened. The list came into being in 2009, and one species, the dwarf lizard, or the scientifically known as Copotis selenica, was split into 2 soon after. And according to the interpretation of the law, if a species is split into 2 or 3, the protected species status of the original species will stand with both of the split species. So therefore, since Copotis selenica was deemed as a strictly protected reptile, the 2 species that were split it later on become strictly protected reptiles. And the other one that was added to the list but not in the original list is a species of Ceratophora known as Ceratophora ukweli, named after Dr. Kanishta Ukuela. It was named in 2021, if I remember correct. And since the genus of Ceratophora, which is endemic to this country, is protected, all newly discovered Ceratophora species will automatically get protected. So the list originally had 16 species. Now it is having 18 species in the strictly protected list. And some of these strictly protected species, like the Ceratophora species or horned lizards, are illegally traded. So that is the tragedy. Although we have prohibited the capture of any of these species, or keeping them is also an offense, exposing them to trade or selling them is also strictly prohibited because it's a strictly protected species, still they are traded out of the country. So there is something wrong. I will come to that later on. The third is the birds. Birds are protected under section 31, and we have protected birds and strictly protected birds. Birds are a different category because we have migratory birds coming into this country. And when it comes to migratory birds, all migrants, whether they are common migrants, rare migrants, vagrants, or even stragglers, are protected as they enter the Sri Lankan waters. So protected birds includes a lot of species, and we get addition every migratory season. And even in this season, we have 2 new records for this country, which automatically become protected once and when they are within the country. The list of strictly protected birds is 63 species long, quite a long list, with 27 of the 34 endemics also in the strictly protected category. And according to the list and the species that are traded, we see some of the strictly protected birds are also traded within the country as pets, which is a tragedy. We have the legal provisions in place, but the enforcement mechanism is not that strong to combat it in a satisfactory manner. So still we have species like the Layard's parakeet or the emerald collared parakeet, and also the Sri Lanka lorikeet. 2 species of parakeets that are found in country are still traded, although they are strictly protected. But some of the strictly protected birds are never traded, and they are well protected, and so is the majority of the protected birds. We only have 5 species of birds that are not protected, which includes the 2 crows, the 2 munias known as the white-backed munia and the scaly-breasted munia. Out of the 5 munias, we have 1 species, which is the hill munia, or the black-faced munia, that is strictly protected. Then 2 are protected, then 2 of the munias are not protected, and we have the rose-tailed parakeet that is not protected. But all these birds also derive a certain degree of protection. I will come to that later on. When it comes to amphibians, section 31A of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance deals with amphibians, and except for 10 amphibians, all the amphibian species that are in this country, and also the amphibians that are newly discovered, are all protected under this provision. And the fish are also protected under section 31A. And out of this list of species of fish, 17 species are freshwater fishes, whereas 7 species are marine species. We all know we need a lot of other species to be included in this list, but still it is not happening, and it has to happen if we want to conserve some of the endemic species that are quite rare and restricted to a particular zone, and also some of the marine species that are globally endangered. If we want to protect them in our waters, we have to protect them either under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance or under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. Then coming to invertebrates, section 31B deals with all invertebrates that needs to be protected, and that includes all species of butterflies, all species of moths, all the species of dragonflies and damselflies, and also all the species of corals that are found within the area that falls within Sri Lankan waters. So therefore, all coral species are protected, and no coral trade can be permitted under this provision of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. Then coming to the domestic trade in plants, the species that Manori mentioned is the Vallapatta, which is not protected under section 42, but it is protected in another way under the Forest Conservation Ordinance. But when it comes to section 42, a long list of plants are there in schedule 8, which are protected plants. And also, in addition, section 45 has provisions to protect any species that we need to protect either fully or partly. So under section 45, the minister can make regulations under this provision, unlike in section 42, which has been named in the schedule. The minister can always include new species and also ensure the degree of protection that they need under section 45. Under this particular section, that is section 45, we have the cultivated cinnamon plant, which is partly protected because no planting material can be exported, but all processed material can be exported. And all 7 species of crop oil relatives of the cinnamon which are endemic to this country are protected totally under section 45. So this section can be made use of to regulate the trade and regulate the wild collection of species, but not to completely ban the usage of such species. So that is a different kind of approach that has been made use of by the provisions of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. Then we come to the export trade. Under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, section 40, no person can export any animal or part of any animal from the country except under a permit under section 40. And no permit is given for trade purposes under section 40. The permitting is restricted to the the exchange of specimens between zoos or exchange of specimens between museums or the sending of specimens for conservation and educational and research purposes. Therefore, section 40 explicitly prohibits the trade in all wild animals, whether they are protected species or non-protected species. So even if a protected species is not protected under one of the foregoing provisions of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, it is nevertheless protected from being exported by provisions of section 40. When it comes to the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, there is a provision in section 30 which empowers the minister to make an order to restrict or prohibit the trade of any species of fish. And for the purpose of the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, the term fish means any aquatic animal. Therefore, the minister can declare any aquatic animal as prohibited from being exported or restricting the export. And we have lists of species which are prohibited from being exported. And there are certain species that need a permit for their exportation. And the permitting procedure has been designated to regulate the trade, but not to prohibit it. So that provision is there either to prohibit or to restrict, and the schedules are not in the act, but the orders are made by the minister and published in the Gazette. And so far we have two sets of regulations that have certain provisions to deal with the regulation of the exports, and there are several provisions that totally ban the export of such species. Then comes the Forest Conservation Ordinance, which has regulations published in the Gazette Extraordinary number 1161/1, which makes it mandatory to get a permit from the Forest Conservation Department for the export of any forest produce. So the plants that are not protected under sections 42 and 45 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance come under the provisions of this. And therefore, any unprotected plant or their parts or the products made from that plant, if it is a wild plant, needs a permit from the Forest Conservation Department for their exportations. Then comes the importation, and imports of any animal to this country need the permit under section 37 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. And this permit can be made use of to import animals for trade purposes. Unlike the export, import can be made for trade purposes, but if they are traded domestically, they have to first see that they have been brought to this country legally under section 37. Then we come to the last part, the constraints. One is the inadequate monitoring. We know that these departments are having woefully inadequate manpower and resources to monitor these trades, and therefore it's sometimes quite difficult for them to monitor all the places where these illegal things happen. Then head on heels come the identification and other problems, which is due to inadequate training. And also there are attitudes in some of the personnel which makes them not to do their duty in due diligence, and that is what we call indifference attitude or the laziness of them. Then comes the low morale coming from inadequate monitoring, inadequate training, inadequate facilities, and there is also political and other interferences and also corruption. These are the constraints that we feel which are hampering the efforts of these authorities in enforcing the law in a satisfactory manner. This is not something very strange, but these things are there in every country. But what we should strive for is to minimize these things to the satisfaction of the fauna and flora to be. And here is the last thing that I want to emphasize. What the law enforcers need to know. They should know the procedural laws from the legal point of view. They should know the other laws that have some bearing on their work. They should know how to apply the law. They should know how to make an investigation so that they could come up with the prosecution and the due process of prosecution. And the last thing that I want to emphasize is that every member of the society has a role to play. We all know that we are required to protect the environment under Article 28 of the Constitution. So we have to have 4 things in mind if we want to prevent illegal wildlife trade, as we need to do in other aspects of environmental protection. First and foremost is we should be aware what is happening and the species that are involved, the modus operandi of the illegal wildlife trade, so that we know what needs to be done. Then the second thing is we need eternal vigilance. Not only the authorities, all of us can play a role in being vigilant in this society. The third is we have to assert our rights in protecting the environment. It is not a luxurious thing. It is a basic need for us to survive, as Professor Padmalal showed you a little while ago. And the fourth element is that every member of the society should have a sense of social responsibility. We need to do our best to ensure that this country and this environment of this country is conducive for living beings in the next generation. So we have a responsibility towards the next generations in protecting the environment and passing on it in a better condition than what we inherited. Unfortunately, it's happening the other way around, but our social responsibility is not diminished, but enlarged due to the present day situation. So this is the thing that I really want to emphasize. When it comes to legal practitioners, we have the social responsibility of helping the law enforcement officials. We have the responsibility of helping the law to become more enforceable. We have to help them where they have inefficiency or inadequacy in their own departments or authorities. We have the right to intervene in cases where there is a need to intervene. We can also file action in appropriate courts if the situation is not very favorable towards the protection of the wildlife of this country from illegal wildlife trade. And that is all I want to emphasize for the day. Thank you very much for the Environmental Foundation and the Bar Association of Sri Lanka for providing me this opportunity to present the domestic legal situation as per the wildlife trade, and especially about the illegal wildlife trade and the mechanisms and the provisions of the different laws that we may be using to tackle this situation for the betterment of the future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gunawardena, for that detailed presentation. It's truly impressive how you can mention these sections, and even I've personally been at your lectures when you even species that you're able to recite their scientific names without any problem whatsoever. Thank you so much for your knowledge. Next, I would like to invite Professor Camena Guneratne to speak about Sri Lanka's obligations under the international instruments in relation to wildlife. Prior to that, a brief introduction about Professor Guneratne. She is a senior attorney at law, and she is currently a senior professor at the Department of Legal Studies at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Also, she is the former head of Department of the Legal Studies and the Dean of Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Open University of Sri Lanka. She is also a member of the Incorporated Council of Legal Education. She has taught environmental law in several universities for more than 25 years. She is a former director of the Environmental Foundation Limited, and currently she is a director at Transparency International and Women and Media Collective, and the chairperson of the board of the Center of Poverty Analysis. Professor Guneratne.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Bar Association and Environmental Foundation for the opportunity to share this with you all. Since we are running a little behind time, I will start off. So what I have been asked to talk to you about, so Jagath told you about the national laws on illegal wildlife trade, and I've been asked to talk to you all about the international side. So as a brief introduction, let me tell you a little bit, I'm sure some of you do know this, about multilateral environmental agreements. Now, as you know, in order to solve an environmental problem, it cannot be done by one or two countries. You need a global effort and global cooperation. So there are over 500 of these agreements on various aspects: loss of biodiversity, climate change, hazardous waste, and trade in endangered species, signed by almost every country in the world. So these MEAs plays a very important role in environmental protection and management because they help national governments to put in place policies. There's an overall framework that everybody knows about. There are certain commitments that every country should abide by. And there are also certain incentives. I mean, there could be financing to help countries like Sri Lanka to fulfill their obligations. And the other thing these MEAs do is they raise public awareness of environmental issues, and they can also catalyze action on various issues. So when a country signs these agreements, they have various obligations. So you need compliance. You have to adhere to the obligations of the agreement. You have to implement. Here, there's a chat. Okay. You have to implement what the convention tells you to do. And that could involve also formulating certain laws. You have to make sure that what you're doing is effective and fulfilling the goals of the agreement. Now, unfortunately, environmental agreements are not as legally binding as, for example, human rights agreements, where, as you know, we are taken to Geneva, we are scolded, sanctions are threatened on us. Environmental agreements, normally you cannot do that kind of thing, but you still, countries do have obligations if you have signed them. Okay. Now, all of these agreements have certain institutional structures that are common. So they'll have a secretariat, which is based in some part of the world. Then they have what is called the Conference of the Parties. So which means that all the countries who have signed will meet every 2 or 3 years. Last couple of months ago, you had the Conference of the Parties on the Climate Change Agreement. And all the countries get together and they discuss all aspects of the agreement. They look at new issues, they look at procedural issues, they look at whether the treaty needs to be revised, various aspects like that. Then you also have scientific and technical committees, which will provide the scientific information and data and advice that is necessary to take these decisions. And then you have various ad hoc committees that might be set up for specific reasons. Right. Now, there are 5 conventions which are called the 5 biodiversity-related conventions. Now, as you can see from the names of these conventions, they are very long, and they're usually referred to by some shortened form. Very often they are referred to by the name of the place where it was signed. So the Wetlands Convention is called the Ramsar Convention because it was signed in Ramsar. Now what we are looking at here is the second one in red. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, which is actually one of a fairly old convention. It was set out in 1973. Okay. And you can see some of the others dealing with very specific issues. So these are the 5 biodiversity related conventions. So now let's take a look at what CITES is doing. As you can see, the logo of CITES is a stylized elephant, because the elephant is the iconic species that is in serious danger because of trading in the ivory. So what does CITES deal with? CITES deals with species of wild fauna and flora and their possible extinction. So obviously there are many causes for such extinction. Dr. Padmalal and Manori have touched on this, but CITES only deals with one specific issue, that is the international trade and the impact that the international trade is having on the survival of these species. And the preamble to the convention recognizes that international cooperation is essential for the protection of certain species of wild fauna and flora against overexploitation through international. Right. Now, okay, so why is trade a problem? Manori has also touched on this. Actually, most trade is legal, right? And the legal trade was estimated in the early 1990s to be 160 billion US dollars. And in 2005, which is 20 years ago, 300 billion US dollars. By now, it may be 600 billion. Now, these are figures that I have got off the internet. How accurate they are, whether they are an overestimation or an underestimation, I don't think anybody can really tell. But the estimate is that it is simply massive. Now, this is the legal trade. Obviously, the illegal trade, we can't even tell because it's illegal and nobody knows what's going on. But Interpol, I think Manori also touched on this, Interpol has agreed that the illegal wildlife trade is only second to drugs and arms as a worldwide black market. So that is pretty huge. The other point is, it again, as Manori, I remember she said this, it is increasingly being driven by organized crime, by transnational organized crime syndicates. And I will come back to that later. Now, why is it that we can't control this trade? Well, obviously, because the value of the trade is so huge, it's probably bigger than the money that countries have to be able to combat it. I mean, when you think about it, no one has been able to control the drug trade. So it's going to be equally difficult to control the wildlife trade and the arms trade as well. Poverty and increased wealth, the two ends of the spectrum, also contribute to this trade. On the one hand, you have the poor who are catching the animals and engaging in the trade for they themselves to survive. On the other hand, you have increasing wealth of people which drives the demand for exotic species to keep as pets. I don't know whether you remember, but when they arrested some drug smuggler in Mexico, they found that he had a huge, almost a zoo of tigers, lions, all kinds of endangered species. So increased wealth is also driving this demand for species, and the need to be able to say greed. You know, the need to be able to say, I possess this. I have something that nobody else has. There is also the lack of political will to control it. And I think we know all about that. Okay. So what is CITES doing about this? What is the role that CITES can play? Right. So here again, the preamble to the convention is saying that wild fauna and flora are an irreplaceable part of the natural systems of the earth, which if you remember Dr. Padmalal's presentation, you can relate to that. And it has to be protected for our generation and for future generations. And without international cooperation, no one country or two countries or a few countries can do that. It has to be a global effort, with every country putting its best foot forward to stop this trade. CITES gives you various technical definitions, which I'll just touch on. So it defines what a species is. These are all the scientific definitions. It defines what specimens are. So plant or animal, whether dead or alive, parts of the plant or animal, the bark, the root, internal organs, the horn, the tusk, whatever. Then there's a specific section on plants, and we should not forget plants. We tend to concentrate on animals, but there's a huge trade in plants, and plants are also in danger of going extinct because of the trade in plants. Okay. So how does CITES work? Well, basically all that CITES does is it tries to regulate the trade in species, and it creates 3 appendices. And species are classified and put into these 3 appendices, and these are all negotiated at the conference of the parties. And then according to the appendix that the species is put in, the trade can be prohibited or permitted with strict regulations. So CITES has the Plants Committee and the Animals Committee, which provides the scientific information and the scientific data and the recommendations. And then this is negotiated at the conference of the parties. So these are the 3 CITES appendices. So Appendix 1 is species threatened with extinction, and including all elephants, and I think a lot of Sri Lankan species are on this. And species threatened with extinction, commercial trade is prohibited, right? Species can only be exported for scientific purposes. Appendix 2 is species which are not actually threatened with extinction but are vulnerable, and where the trade may increase the risk of not surviving, and their trade is regulated. Appendix 3 is where a country can designate a species as being a cause of concern and ask other countries also to help in regulating the trade in that species. So it is actually a very simple process, right? It is just, so it's a question of export permits, import permits. So if a species goes from, say, Sri Lanka to New Zealand, we have to issue an export permit, they have to issue an import permit. If it transits through a certain country, that country also gets involved and has to issue the relevant permits and so on. A very simple process. So in order to carry out this process, every country has to designate a management authority, which is the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and the scientific authorities, which are these 6 departments: wildlife, botanical gardens, zoological gardens, museums, forests and fisheries and aquatic resources. So these are all the government departments whose job is to implement CITES. Okay. So as I said, very simple. So how successful is this? I mean, how effective? Well, the biggest problem is that CITES is actually trying to control the legal trade. But obviously, it cannot control the illegal trade because the illegal trade is not going to be regulated. It also applies only to listed species. If the species gets into one of those appendices, if it doesn't, it's not covered. Now, listing the species is often political. There's a lot of negotiation going on at the conference of the parties. There is sort of political toing and froing and so on. So the listing or delisting or not listing may not actually be scientific, but maybe for other reasons. Lack of data is often a problem. Whether there is compliance and accountability is doubtful. Now, for example, we know that an export permit was given to send a baby elephant to the New Zealand zoo, and a case was filed stopping that. So there are, even within the country, even when giving these export permits, there can be controversies. Sanctions imposed on countries are not always effective. Some of the African countries have tried to delist their elephants, saying that they wanted to, that they now have, overpopulation, and they want to cull the population and earn money by selling the ivory, and there was a lot of controversy about that. So that kind of thing also happens. The permit system can be manipulated. You normally don't prosecute under this. And also, CITES does not deal with internal trafficking. Right? So CITES is limited. Now, this doesn't mean to say that CITES is completely ineffective. It has been effective, but nevertheless, it is still limited. So the question is, how can you actually deal with the illegal trade? Right? Which means you need to go for criminal sanctions. Whatever is illegal is criminal. Now, in 2010, this consortium was established. The International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. And it is partnered by the CITES Secretariat, by the International Police, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, the World Bank, and the World Customs Organization. And the objective of this consortium is to strengthen criminal justice systems and provide support to countries at all levels, national, regional, and international level, to combat wildlife crime, including trafficking in species. Okay. So they will give technical assistance, tools, training, operational support, right along the criminal justice chain, building capacity among everybody right down the line, right down the pipeline, to try and stop this trade. Okay. So that was one development. Okay, so as I said, these are the 5 partner organizations, and I would like to focus on the last one, the UNODC. Now, the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, was established in 1997. And initially, its mandate was to address drug-related crime, but then it went further. And it goes into general crime prevention and assisting with criminal justice processes. And it also has now looked at organized crime and terrorism as well. Right? Now, in the light of that, I would like to draw your attention to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. This convention was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2000, entered into force in 2003, 147 signatories, 190 parties, and Sri Lanka has also signed it and ratified it. So Sri Lanka is a full party to this convention. Now the UNTOC is a kind of a framework convention, and it has certain protocols which focus on specific issues of transnational organized crime, right? So the commitments of state parties, whoever has signed this, including Sri Lanka, will be, you have to create domestic criminal offenses, right? Offenses like participating in an organized criminal group, money laundering, corruption, obstruction of justice, so on and so forth. You have to have the frameworks for extradition so that countries can cooperate with each other in extraditing people they have arrested. There has to be mutual legal assistance and law enforcement cooperation. and also training and technical assistance for developing capacity of national authorities right down the chain. So some states will give the assistance, some states like Sri Lanka will receive the assistance, we need that kind of thing, right? So there is this overall cooperation. Now, as I mentioned, the convention itself sets out a framework, and there are certain protocols which focus on specific types of organized crime, transnational organized crime. And these are the current protocols, all of which Sri Lanka has signed, which are in effect. So one relates to human trafficking, right? Particularly of women and children. Then there is the one on smuggling of migrants, also a form of trafficking. And then there is a protocol on illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms. So at the moment, the three protocols under this convention relate to humans and firearms. But there is another proposal in the pipeline. This has actually been drafted. The draft is available on the internet if you want to look it up. And the proposal is the protocol against the illicit trafficking in specimens of wild fauna and flora. Right? So now what people are trying to do is they are trying to criminalize the trafficking of wildlife as well under the UNTOC and bring in this protocol. So as I said, it's drafted. It's still under negotiation. I think many organizations and interest groups are pushing for it. It is very likely that at some point it will happen. So the proposed provisions are to prevent and combat the illicit trafficking in specimens of wild fauna and flora, both plants and animals, and to promote cooperation among state parties for this purpose, for this objective. Right? Now, if this protocol sees the light of day and Sri Lanka does sign it, then we have certain obligations. So firstly, we will have to enact legislation to give effect to the protocol. Now, I have given you some examples of some statutes passed by Parliament that have been enacted to give effect to conventions that we have signed. Because as you know, we are a dualist country. Just by signing a convention, the convention does not become part of our law. So in 2001, we passed an act to give effect to the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction. And in 2005, we signed an act to give effect to the Convention on the Suppression of Terrorist Financing. So similarly, if this protocol comes into force and we sign it, we will then have to pass a special act to give effect to the provisions of that protocol. And we will have to criminalize wildlife trafficking. It will have to become a criminal act with punishments and penalties. And we will also have to put in force the measures for confiscation, seizure, forfeiture, disposal of specimens that have been illicitly trafficked. Now, if you remember the incident with the stock of ivory that was confiscated by customs, there was a lot of controversy about that as well, because initially there was a suggestion that it should be distributed among various entities. And then I think there was public objection, but it took about 2 or 3 years before that stock of ivory was finally destroyed, because there is no law which enforces that. So under this protocol, if we do sign it, we will have to bring in that kind of law to do all this. Then we'll have to establish border controls and strengthen our border control measures for prevention and detection. And that means, capacity building, education, awareness among a whole range of government departments. The police will have to be trained, not only forest and wildlife, the Coast Guard, the Navy, whoever detects. Right? And then, of course, there is information exchange and cooperation with other parties. Right? And awareness, education, which is in a sense part of what we are doing at this moment. So at the moment, this has not come into force, but it is in the pipeline. It is highly likely that it will be pushed and it will be adopted because the international community has seen the gravity of the consequences of illegal wildlife trafficking on the survival of species. So in the future, maybe in the next few years, this might happen. But even if it does come into force, again, you know, there are limitations. I mean, this is a huge problem to deal with. I mean, no country can say that it has got the better of the drug problem, even the arms problem, right? So whether we will ever get the better of the illegal wildlife trafficking problem, I don't know, but we have to do our best and at least tackle it as best as we can. Now, one of the limitations of this is, since this is a convention on transnational organized crime, the problem is it will have to meet that threshold. If it doesn't come within the definition of transnational organized crime, then you might have issues, right? Which means ideally Sri Lanka should anyway strengthen its internal laws on wildlife trafficking. And again, even this convention, this protocol would not deal with internal trafficking, which is happening quite a lot, right? Every state party would have to criminalize wildlife trafficking. Whether they are willing to do that, we don't know. But anyway, these are not things that should discourage us. We do need to move forward, right? And this is because CITES cannot deal with the illegal trafficking. CITES is only trying to regulate what is legal. This seems to be one way of dealing with the real problem of illegal trafficking. So to summarize, so CITES deals with regulation of the illegal trade, legal trade. The illegal trade has to be criminalized. Both have limitations, but those limitations will have to be overcome. If there is political will to do that, which is sometimes doubtful. But as Jagath also said, we need public awareness, we need cooperation, we need sensitivity, we need public interest. We also need a lot of training in identification of specimens, for instance. Now, I'm sure if even the police catch drugs or guns, they know they are drugs or guns. But to train the police and other entities to recognize specimens of plants and animals would be much more difficult. Right? The fact that trafficking is very largely related to transnational organized crimes means it's operating at a huge level. And that is always difficult to deal with. And finally, we also need to deal with internal trafficking, which is something that we have to do ourselves, which cannot be done at international level. That is a domestic problem that we have to address. So I'll stop there. And I think now we can take questions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Professor Gunaratne. That was certainly not one of the easiest of the topics to cover. However, I just hope to open the floor to some questions that we've received. And if I may start with Professor Gunaratne, the question regarding our responsibilities or duties regarding the international conventions that Sri Lanka is a signatory to. One of the common objections that we face in court when we, in the course of a writ application, would be based on the judgment of former Chief Justice in Singarasa versus the Attorney General, where the monist and dualist theories are contested, and despite Sri Lanka signing or ratifying conventions, whenever the obligations are sought to be enforced in court, more often than not, court seems to take the view that when domestic or when enabling legislation hasn't been passed, that Sri Lanka is not bound to follow duties under the conventions. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, if that argument is made, can't you then cite Justice A.R.B. Amarasinghe in the Pavala case, where he basically said that even though we are a dual state, we are duty bound to implement environmental norms, international environmental norms and standards, leave alone conventions. Would that not be a counter argument? He was very clear on that, and he made a very sweeping statement on that.
Thank you, Professor Gunaratne. I will certainly keep that in mind the next time we go to the Court of Appeal.
Just a follow up. Yes, I know that it is a barrier, but if in the event we do sign, and if this protocol does come into force and we sign it, I think Parliament would have to really pass enabling legislation. Because, like human trafficking, this is as serious. So we have passed legislation to give effect to the SARC Convention on Human Trafficking. So I think we need to push for a parliamentary statute, in which case then, of course, the court's argument would not be of any force.
Thank you, Professor Gunaratne. My next question would be to Professor Padmalal regarding the conservation of biodiversity. There was an example that was cited regarding the Sri Lankan golden toad, which basically became extinct due to extensive field studies. And though the extinction was not due to trafficking or anything similar to the violation of the protection of the species, when it's a sanctioned or lawfully undertaken exercise where it's based on research, how do we protect, how do we refrain, or how do we protect, how do we prevent a similar situation occurring to a species that might be endemic to Sri Lanka, where if it's subject to unprotected studies as undertaken as part of research, how can we prevent something like this happening in the future to one of our endemic species?
Yeah, as far as as far as the conservation of a particular species are concerned, we have two aspects, as I mentioned earlier. One is the in situ conservation, the other one is the ex situ conservation. So in situ conservation, you protect the animal's habitat, and also at the same time you have the law aspect of it. The second one is the ex situ conservation aspect, where we take some sample from that area and we can go for a reintroduction program. So because of this, one thing is mainly due to the habitat destruction. So we'll have, with immediate effect, you must bring those important areas under some sort of protections, right? So therefore, the different concept of protected area establishments are there, but in that is as long as due to some of the the environmental factors, these species can be wiped out apart from the habitat destructions. So therefore, both in situ and ex situ conservation will have to take immediate the measures in order to protect that one, apart from the legal actions and the what is called listing them under the different schedules of the respective legislation. So in situ conservation supported by ex situ conservation and the legal aspects, and studying further habitat relation of those animals and the other spatial distributions are paramount of importance in conserving them as a field program. I think I answered your question.
Yes, Dr. Padmalal, thank you so much. The next question I would like to pose to Mrs. Manori Gunawardena regarding the impact of wildlife, Mrs. Manori Gunawardena, regarding the impact of wildlife trafficking, especially when it comes to a keystone species which, if not protected, what would be the consequences of the extinction of a keystone species in Sri Lanka? And would you have any examples of such an occurrence in Sri Lanka?
We don't have an example of a keystone species per se, but just to say what a keystone species is, just in case people don't know what that means, it is a species that is literally like the brick that holds it all together, right? So if you take an arch and there are bricks and there's a species that holds it together, and when that you remove it, everything else collapses. So normally that's how you define a keystone species. There are some species that you would call an umbrella species. So an umbrella species is where, by virtue of it being there, the habitat is protected, therefore all the other species under that umbrella are protected. So if you take an umbrella species, so for example, if you take any of our wide-ranging megafauna, so if you take something like elephants or leopards, sloth bear, for example, they are indicators of our dry zone forests. Now, of course, some of them, the elephants are gone from our red zone forests because the habitats are no longer viable or vast. So what happens is that once a keystone or a key species is removed, you see a timely degradation of that forest or habitat. It won't be sort of a sudden thing where you will suddenly see, the forest die back, but you may see it in time. But the most important thing to understand is that all these species have a very important role to play in that ecosystem. So keystone versus umbrella for Sri Lanka, it's really important to recognize that there are many species that can be considered umbrella species. And those are vital to protect those ecosystems. So when I say ecosystems and habitats, I'm not saying just protected areas. I think we need to look beyond the protected area box. I know we have legally protected areas. So because of that, we seem to kind of compartmentalize them. They are set aside for certain different rationale. But, habitats are not just protected areas, they're island-wide. And we really need to look at protection of those habitats and then the key species within them. So if you look at even smaller species, there are some small species that are extremely vital. So for example, stream ecosystems, you have amphibians that are unique and found in very, very few areas. They are unique to those ecosystems and the services they provide. So they are also not only sort of the keystone, they're also the indicator. So it's sort of almost the canary in the coal mine. When they're gone, something's happened to that environment. And sometimes we won't see the repercussions of it till much later on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Mr. Gunawardena, I believe you are referring to point.
Yeah, yes. Is there a follow-up?
I'm sorry.
I think your video is off.
Yes. Our next question.
Are there any more questions?
Are there any questions?
Yes, there are.
Can we ask people to type in the question?
Our next question is to Dr. Jagath Gunawardena as to how a party may institute legal proceedings in a matter of public interest litigation.
When it
Dr.
comes to public interest litigation on illegal wildlife trade, we can have certain things that any lawyer can do. One is to file an action in the Court of Appeal by way of writ application if there is some wrongdoing on part of one or more of the authorities, or it could also be a fundamental rights application. But I'm emphasizing more on helping the law enforcement authorities when it comes to a case of illegal wildlife trade. Let me put it in three ways. One way is to institute a private legal action in the magistrate's court, because all these actions are criminal activities under different enactments. So one is to institute a private action under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, which has given provisions for any private party which is interested to file action under section 60E of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. Of course, they have to give notice to the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and if they don't file action, anyone can file action after that period is over. The second option is the option that we had been using initially when I was in the Environmental Foundation. We used to intervene in certain matters before the magistrate court and lead evidence on behalf of the prosecution or help the prosecution by appearing along with the Wildlife Department or the police or the Forest Department or the Coast Conservation Department. So that's one action that is possible. If the department files action and if the departments are having issues in continuing with the prosecution, we can all intervene under the provisions of section 260 of the Criminal Procedure Code, where any aggrieved party can make an intervention to a case that is pending and make our own submissions and even lead evidence if necessary, or help the department or the authority to lead evidence. So that's one thing that we can explore as legal professionals. If the case is coming up where the prosecution is led by the Wildlife Department or the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Department or by the Forest Conservation Department, we can help them by intervening in the matter. So this is one area where we can make a big contribution by making some effort in trying to combat this illegal trade. The third option is for us to help in drafting answers or drafting plans or drafting charges or framing charges. So we can help the departments and authorities in their prosecution efforts by helping them with their legal tasks, because some departments like the Wildlife Conservation Department does not have any legal staff in their departmental staff. So they have to rely on their officers who have some legal experiences, or they rely on the Attorney General's department for their prosecution work. But of course, we can help them doing some of these things for them to have a better prosecution. So I think I have answered your question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gunawardena. Next question is to Dr. Padmalal. As most of the endemic species can be found within the montane zones and the wet zone areas, how is it that these areas are not reflected as protected areas as of now?
Yeah, major problem in establishing protected areas is there was that the, as you are well aware, the protected areas was first established in dry zone areas as hunting grounds for the Sudha fellows. Then subsequently they were converted to wildlife reserves. So the biodiversity distribution of biodiversity taken into consideration after Convention of Biological Diversity, and subsequently we did the National Conservation Review. So when establishing protected areas, it was a hunting ground. Then they declared most of the protected areas in the dry zone area due to the irrigations and other agricultural projects. For instance, the Alloya, Senanayaka and Mahali projects. So these are not endemic oriented centered programs, but giving the habitat for displaced and other wildlife and catchment conservation program and economic development. So the biodiversity requirement actually came into the scene just after the biodiversity convention, and then we identified most of the areas in the wet zone areas as and also research finding revealed that the endemicity is concentrated mainly on southern the central hills and the southwestern Sri Lanka. So by that time, majority of the areas are already cleared, and we are having a very serious problem as geographical representation of the protected area that covers biodiversity. So that is mainly because of our main objective in establishing protected area right from the beginning was not biodiversity or endemicity oriented programs. That is the case.
Thank you, Doctor. Following from that question, could we not seek relief by way of a writ in the Court of Appeal, asking for these areas to be protected as part of the environmental plan for 2023 or the latest plan from the 10-year plan that's supposed to have already been implemented from 2022 to 2035 or 20?
To me or you? To whom you were?
I put it to Dr. Padmalal since
the problem is what is important thing is that when you consider those areas, we have a huge problem in allocating those lands for protected area network. The protected area coming under the Wildlife and Forest Department in the central land, should come under Wildlife Department or the Forest Department. Those are the major governing agencies that have been given the mandate. So therefore, in establishing protected area, that is not only the presence of animals, there are so many issues. Area identification, problem identifications, declaration, feasibility studies, and everything will have to come. But as far as central highlands and the southern areas are concerned, we don't have much land, though other forests are there. On the other hand, there is another opportunity for us during last 20 years, that is the other state forests located in those areas gave some sort of protection to those areas. But anyway, with the new development under the new biodiversity action plan at the global scale, we are also going to introduce sensitive environmental policy under the OECM, other environment conservation measures program. So the Ministry of Environment is coordinating that work that has to be linked with the S16 legislation, and there are some opportunities for us to come up with new areas within those important habitats.
Thank you, Dr. Padmalal. The next question is to Professor Camena Guneratne. Can Sri Lanka utilize mutual legal assistance framework to obtain the aid of other states or countries to combat wildlife trafficking? We could even answer this question with regards to the SAARC regional cooperation that we currently benefit from. Thank you.
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Can Sri Lanka utilize the mutual legal assistance framework to obtain the aid of other states or countries to combat wildlife trafficking?
Yeah, I guess we could, because we have signed the convention, and there is no reason why we can't put that into implementation.
Because there also seems to be a correlation between the trafficking of drugs and the trafficking of wildlife, and Sri Lanka probably being one of the more important transshipment countries.
I think fundamentally it is up to us to initiate. I mean, there is no legal barrier for us to do it, but we have to take the, initiative and start it off. And, trigger off this process of cooperation regionally and even beyond South Asia. But I don't see any legal barrier to that. But
Thank
all
you.
that, I think, requires capacity, knowledge, a certain level of legal backing which maybe the lawyers can give the government departments?
Professor Guneratne, could we not also obtain the assistance of the Honorable Attorney General when it comes to perhaps implementing a plan to obtain mutual legal assistance from other neighboring states?
Okay. Yes, of course. I think the Attorney General's department is actually the department that should be taking the lead in this. I'm not actually sure, maybe Dr. Jagath will know, do they have a unit, Jagath, for wildlife trafficking? Yeah. So they do have a unit. And maybe that unit has to become a little activated.
Just to add, Manori here. Just to add, also there is what is called the South Asia Wildlife Enforcement Network, which the Department of Wildlife Conservation is part of, and the intent of the SAWEN, which is the South Asia Wildlife Enforcement Network, is actually to share intelligence and have cross-border cooperation in terms of combating wildlife trade and trafficking. And this is all the South, which is essentially all the South countries. And that has been established and active, but I don't really know of any key cases that have actually materialized from the SAWEN process itself, but they do convene and meet from time to time. So the mechanisms are already in place. It's a matter of them getting a little bit more activated.
Thank you, Mrs. Gunawardena. A follow-up question as to the practicality of preventing wildlife trafficking. What could an individual do if they observe a simple case of wildlife trafficking? For example, if one were to travel on the Kotte Road, you see a person regularly selling these birds which are in cages, and I personally observed that one of the species in those cages are scaly-breasted munias. So, for example, what can a person do at that point to stop or prevent or help the police take action against such a violation of the law when it comes to protected species?
I'll answer that question. First of all, since you mentioned the name of scaly-breasted munia, let me enlarge my topic a little bit. First of all, the scale-breasted munia is one of the 5 species that are not protected by the provisions of Section 31 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. So for an ordinary person, it may look like they can be traded. But when you look at the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, you can see that the trade in non-protected species, whether it involves the whole animal or whether it involves a part of the animal, cannot be done unless it is something that is approved and permitted by the provisions of Section 49 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and the Wildlife Conservation Department has to give permission for such trade. And we know, as a matter of fact, that no one is allowed to trade in birds, even if they are not protected birds, because no one has been given a permit under Section 49 for the past 3 decades. So therefore, all such birds that are sold along the roadside, although they may be unprotected birds like the rose-ringed parakeet and the scaly-breasted munia, that is an illegal trade. And if that is an illegal trade, the Wildlife Department can take action, and so is the police, because the police is given equal powers under Section 66 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance to take action against any transgression of the provisions of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. In addition, there is an old regulation coming from 1938, which is not yet rescinded, which is empowering the Forest Department also to take legal action if there is a violation of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. That came because at that time there was no Wildlife Conservation Department, and the Forest Department was entrusted with enforcing the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. Therefore, they can make a complaint to the wildlife department or the police, or if both are not available, at least to the forest conservation department. But since police is covering the whole of the country, if the wildlife department doesn't have a presence in that area, they can make a complaint to the police. And the police also has established environmental police units in most of the stations. They may be having a specialized knowledge rather than an ordinary police officer. So if they have an environmental unit, better to make that complaint directed to the environmental police unit so that they will take appropriate action. But sad, but it is a fact that we have to admit, the environmental law enforcement is strengthened only if the law and order situation in the country is satisfactory. And we are in a situation, as we all know, it is not enforced satisfactorily. So environmental law is also taking a dip at the moment. So we have to make it happen. And whenever we see something happening like that, we can make a complaint to the police by dialing the hotline at least. So we can help the law enforcement to become strengthened by making more and more complaints at least.
Thank you, Dr. Gunawardena.
Can I add something there?
Yes, Professor Gunawardena.
This is a little bit of a digression. But you know, all over the world, there's a new movement on animal rights. It's gone into constitutions of countries, it's gone into legislation, it's gone into judicial decisions. What they call animal rights, and which is also called non-human rights. And this argument is being litigated all over, saying that animals have rights in themselves. Not as in the interest of humans, but in their own interest. And talking about birds, there was a very interesting case in Kerala, where somebody filed saying that a person in the market was keeping caged birds. And the judge said all the birds had to be free because they had the right to fly. And now, I don't know whether Sri Lankan lawyers can take this up. It sounds a bit kind of airy-fairy, but actually it is becoming a very concretized legal principle, and it's gaining ground. So you are looking at the right of an animal not to be trafficked, exactly in the same way that a human being has the right not to be trafficked. So we have the Human Trafficking Convention, which is looking at the interests of the human. So maybe this is something that as lawyers, at some point, we can bring these arguments into court and just see how the courts respond to this. Right? The right of the animal in itself.
Can I just ask, just query something in the line of that thought? So is this something where you would say an animal has sort of a legal personhood?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So for example, it's not inconceivable that maybe we could file a case on behalf of the elephants of Yala National Park, saying they have the right to their habitat, to their food and water as living beings. Not as my right to the environment,
Okay.
but as their right. And since obviously they can't file, so we are like their custodians. And as their guardians, we can go to court on their behalf. This is happening all over the world. It's not as crazy as it sounds because judges are increasingly looking at this. They haven't gone into the area of species so much, but there are many instances where rivers have been given legal personhood. And this is happening particularly in South American countries, where it's part of their culture. This Mother Earth kind of ethos, right? So as lawyers, these are also things that we should keep in mind.
Just adding to that issue, I believe, I think a year or two ago, the government of New Zealand actually declared dolphins and rivers to be sentient beings, and the river now has the legal capacity to institute action in the event it finds itself threatened, or the existence or the nature of the river is threatened, it's given legal recognition as a sentient being to file action on behalf of itself. So I believe that might be a good example for our country to follow. Furthermore, a general question to our distinguished panel, would there be any suggestions as to how we could further strengthen the laws that exist in Sri Lanka regarding the protection of wildlife and the prevention of wildlife trafficking?
Okay, first of all, wildlife trafficking is threefold, as I said, but we dealt with only the two aspects of domestic wildlife trafficking and the export trade. And we can see that there are different provisions in the different enactments. So the first and the foremost thing that we have to do is to fill the gaps. For instance, under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act, there are more species to be given protection. Under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, we may have a long list of species that may be given protection, especially when it comes to species of fish and invertebrates. And in the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act also, there are certain species of fish that need to be protected. So that will be the first step in enhancing the protection. Following is the other provision to regulate the trade in species that does not need full protection by way of regulations or amending the regulations to meet the present day needs and the future trends. Another related aspect is to harmonize the different provisions of the different laws. For instance, we may see that the same offense can be prosecuted under the provisions of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance or the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. Take the example of the landing of dolphins and sea turtles. The penalty is much higher in the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance rather than in the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. In addition, it is an cognizable offense under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, but it is not a cognizable offense under the Fisheries and Aquatic Resources Act. Such inadequacies can be harmonized by amending the relevant provisions of that and bringing them into the same plane by amending and strengthening the provisions that need to be amended and strengthened. So that is another thing that we can do. And the third thing that we can do is to have interdepartmental or interinstitutional coordination so that there could be a much better enforcement mechanism in place where if the presence of one authority or department is inadequate, another one can take over the responsibilities of one. So that's another area that we can make use of. For instance, if we can empower all the fisheries officials in the coastal regions to take action against the illegal trade in marine mammals or marine turtles or their parts, including eggs, for instance, we can give them the authority under the provisions of Section 66 of the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance or any other provision in any other law, so that they can also make prosecutions under a different law in this particular area of concern. Not the whole enactment, but at least in certain provisions that their intervention is necessary. The other one is to have more awareness in the public, to create an assertive public group so that they will step in and try to help the authorities or take action on their own accord in combating wildlife trafficking. For that, we need to insert provisions in other laws to enable the members of the public to prosecute if there is lethargy or inaction on the part of the authorities. That provision is there in the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, and that is the only enactment in Sri Lanka that has allowed the member of the public to go to court on behalf of an offense under the ordinance. So that also needs to be explored so that it could be incorporated not in the area of wildlife trade, but in other aspects also, so that it will enhance the public participation in enforcing the law. So those are my suggestions for the present situation.
Thank you, Dr. Gunawardena. One more question regarding what the public can do in the instances of observing a violation of one of our laws. Would it be possible for a member of the public to file a private plaint regarding any offense that they observe without having to go through a complicated situation of filing for relief by way of a writ application? Could they proceed with a private plaint under 136(1)(b)?
They can file private plaint under 136(1)(a), I think. 1B is for government officials. So a 1A application has to be countersigned by the lawyer, signed after being signed by the person who is litigating. But when it comes to proving it is the crux of the matter, because we know that in all criminal actions, we have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. So how we can get adequate evidence to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, and if necessary, how we can get expert evidence to prove our point is the crucial issue, I think, before us. So if we can enhance the expertise within the society by way of having experts in the interested parties to help us in these litigations, maybe we can explore that possibility in the near future. I should add the word near future because time is running out fast and we need to act fast.
Thank you, Dr. Gunawardena. We seem to have come to the end of our session. I would firstly like to place on record our gratitude to our distinguished panelists who've taken time off from their busy schedules on Tuesday evening when they could have done much more. And knowing that the field of environmental law is not the most lucrative area of practice, we still hold you in high esteem for all your contributions in various aspects of environmental law in our beloved country. And I want to thank the Environmental Foundation Limited for putting this webinar together, and place on record the gratitude towards the Bar Association of Sri Lanka and the Environmental Committee. And we hope to have more of these sessions with the participation of distinguished panelists such as Professor Guneratne, Professor Gunawardena, Mrs. Manori Gunawardena, and Dr. Padmalal, and Dr. Camena Guneratne as well. Thank you so much for your valuable time, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall we knock off? So we give it done. Okay, thank you everyone.